So my name's Matt Quinn. I'm a community relations coordinator for Rosecrans Health Network. I've actually been working directly with teens myself in clinical practice for over 15 years. So what I want to talk about for the next 20 minutes-ish is kind of the current state of marijuana and kind of where we're at with marijuana, and also where we're at with vaping, and really trying to weave the two together, and really, in a limited amount of time, really try to hit on the things that I think are the most key components of modern-day marijuana, modern-day vaping, both from research and science, but also you'll probably hear me mix in some of my own clinical experience working with teens that have struggled with this. So if you see more of a leaning toward really trying to prevent and avoid teenagers using, it's just because I've seen a lot of the damage that can be done especially over years and years of vaping and cannabis use. That's why you'll definitely hear that slant in that direction. So probably the most, and Kamala touched on this when she did her introduction, and a lot of you probably know this already, but I think it could definitely use emphasis. So for those of you in the crowd that are parents, those of you who are in your 40s or 50s, I'm in my 40s now, so I see people in that same range, maybe a little bit older, right? You might have a certain kind of conception of what you think of or what you thought of marijuana to be. I put some slides up of things that I thought might be kind of what the previous generation or the generation before that may have thought of when associating with marijuana. The kind of the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s, tie-dye hippies, Grateful Dead, right joints, all those types of things. It's important to know that, especially even in just the past 5 years, I know Kamala mentioned the past 20 years, but even in just the past 5 years, the landscape of marijuana has changed completely. And a lot of it has to do with potency, but a lot of it has to do with just the products too. A lot of marijuana use revolves around things that aren't even the flower part, the bud part of the plant, but derivatives, or things that are extracting different oils and concentrates from the plant itself in the form of the top left there. You could see those are called dabs or waxes. Those are very, very high potency concentrated marijuana products. You have edibles, which a lot of you are probably familiar with to some degree. You have CBD. Which, if you haven't heard about CBD, you're doing a fantastic job of staying off the grid, because it's just become this multi-billion-dollar industry. And then you have really what's been at the root of a lot of the problems that we're seeing with illnesses and with deaths are a lot of them are black market cartridges. They on the bottom right there, the large black pieces of battery, but then you see that yellow liquid, that's a concentrated marijuana extract. And a lot of them that are produced on the black market have things in them that are adulterants, which I'll get into in a little bit here. So I like to lead with that because I think sometimes parents, grandparents, people that are a little bit older, they fall into this misconception of thinking, okay, well, I knew so-and-so did it, or I had a cousin that did it, and it just made them hungry, or it just gave them red eyes, or maybe it made them a little... Please realize that the world of marijuana has completely changed, and that really needs to be taken into consideration when you talk about the risk with young people. So if you look at the potency, I don't know how well you could see that. Certainly you could see the bars going up, and I'll explain what that means. So there's that cold getting me. So up until about the mid-90s, marijuana was on average about 4% THC. THC is that psychoactive component that gets you high. You could see it going up and up and up to the point where now in 2020, it's not reflected on this slide, but in 2020, the average potency is about 20%. And that's for the flower, the plant material itself, okay? Now, when you talk about what a lot of young people are using these days, those dab pens, those cartridges, those extracts, those on average, and these are just the names of some of the products on the left, so that's not really particularly relevant, but you'll see if you just kind of eyeball the middle bar there, you're at about 35% THC. So the plant material is about 5 times stronger. And then these concentrates are on average anywhere from 9 times stronger and up. Those dabs, those waxes, the one that look like kind of like earwax or solidified honey, those can be upward of 90% THC. So when on a weekly basis, I'll get a call from a school nurse here at Naperville North, or any of the schools in the area, and they'll say, Matt, there's no way this could have been marijuana. And I'll explain to them, well, it very well might have been, because if you think about the math behind it, let's say it was one of these cartridges or carts or dab pens that was 35% THC, which again, that's average. And let's say they took 3 puffs on it. That'd be the equivalent of 27 puffs of mid-90s marijuana. 27. So when kids are passing out, they're turning green, they're vomiting, they're ending up in the ER, is it any wonder why those more significant symptoms are happening when you talk about that potency? So this isn't just a world with, again, the red eye, all of the kind of what's become almost it's become a part of common culture to make jokes about, the munchies, and those types of things. But the world we live in now, this is what we're seeing more and more and more because of that potency and how strong these products are, is that we're seeing more and more of these psychotic episodes, hospital visits, impact on learning and memory, distorted perception, all of these things, really critical impact. Even I've heard stories, unfortunately, from parents that are saying that with these high-potency products where their teen ended up in the hospital for several days because they had a psychotic episode. And the really scary thing, obviously that's scary in of itself, right? But then they'll report 6 months later their kid still wasn't the same. So this is the world we live in. And again, this is just matter of fact. I'm not trying to scare, but I think it's really important to understand the nuts and bolts of potency. And this is, in Illinois, again, not trying to make this political. Campbell did a great job of mentioning that we want to make this educational. But the reality of it is there's no caps on potency in Illinois. So there's going to be products like this out there. And so I think as a community, it's really important to be mindful of this and be aware of this and the impact it might have on young people. And then if you look at over the past 20 years, how marijuana, the perception around it and how dangerous it is, has just gone down and down and down drastically. If you look at 1991, 2006, I tried to take little snapshots just to give you a sense of how, and any of the young people in the audience know this. They're around enough young people, they know they know how marijuana is perceived. They get it, right? But if you think about what I just showed you regarding the potency of the products and the increase in these really severe symptoms, in my mind, the perception of harm shouldn't be crisscrossing, should they? You'd think if it's stronger and there's more of a risk involved with it, that there should be the perception of harm increasing, but it's going the other way. And I'm really concerned about that moving forward. Is that decreased perception of harm with increased potency and what that might mean for more young people trying it, more young people getting addicted to it quicker because it's stronger, more young people trying it, not realizing how strong it is and ending up in the ER, getting sick, all of these things that we're seeing. I'm just worried, just because I'm worried it's going to be out there more, I'm worried we're going to start to see more of this. And then you combine that with, really, in my mind, there's really two pillars in my mind of why it's so important that young people don't use drugs. One is brain development, which Dr. Weiner is going to get into. I'm kind of providing some of the kind of nuts and bolts education pieces, and then he's going to springboard into talking about some of the health impacts of all this. And then the other piece is just that risk of progressing later on into a more significant substance use issue. It's a lot higher when you talk about somebody starting to use in that 12 to 17 or 18-year-old age range, where you're talking about 9 out of 10 times. In other words, almost all people that later develop a more severe substance use issue, they almost always start before the age of 18. Now, that's not me saying, okay, just wait till you're 18 and go crazy. That's not what I'm saying. But I think it's really relevant and important information to know that brain development between the ages of 12 and 18, that brain's really susceptible. That reward system, the developing parts of the brain are really susceptible to grabbing onto alcohol, to grabbing onto nicotine, to grabbing onto marijuana. Okay, so quick gear shift here. Let's talk about vaping. Now, the picture on the left is a humidifier. The picture on the right is an aerosol can. Now, when you hear the word vapor, right? Vaping. When you hear quick show of hands, when you hear the word vapor, aside from Juul and all these different devices, right? When you hear the word vapor, who thinks of the humidifier, the picture on the left? Thank you, up front, appreciate that, thank you. The reason I do that is because when I ask that question, usually 80% of the hands go up for the left. Okay, now these devices that are being inhaled, Juul, right, nicotine, marijuana, is it, quick show of hands, is it more like what's on the left? Oh, okay, so you guys are paying attention to the news. This is good. No, it's actually more like what's on the right. It's an aerosol. But to me, this is really important because, in my mind, a huge part of the reason why this really exploded about 3 or 4 years ago is because the terminology changed. E-cigarettes have been around for a decade. But when the terminology changed to vaping, it played on that kind of subconscious or subliminal idea of humidifier air. And then you add in the flavoring agents, which fortunately we're making quick and strong strides to get off the market. But when you combine those two things, and then you combine the early years with tool of social media and really advertising to youth and using young models and those types of things, and then just relying, then young people themselves, just kind of that social media element kind of grew its own head of steam. Think about it this way: if 3 or 4 years ago the terminology changed to aerosoling, do you think we'd be talking about this as much? Right? So I think it's important that we really recognize, and I'm not encouraging you that we're going to say, in the next year we're going to get that turned around and it's going to be called aerosoling. What I'm saying is that it's really important to try to get this to filter down to young people that it's not vapor, it's aerosol, okay? You're talking about all these different chemicals. That's just for dramatic effect, those pictures that you just saw there. Now, in various lab tests, that's not to say in all these devices all of these chemicals have shown up, but there's been some combination of these different chemicals that have shown up in independent lab tests in that aerosol that's being inhaled in all these different devices that young people have been using over the past 4 or 5 years. And what's interesting, you'll see some of them are in yellow. The ones in yellow are also in cigarettes, which is really interesting because I can't tell you how many young people that I've either assessed or seen in counseling where I say, do you smoke cigarettes? And I love the reaction I get. It's always like, ew, gross, no way. My grandfather died from smoking cigarettes. But then I'll ask, do you vape? Oh yeah, every day. There's still a big gap. I think it's closing a little by little because of the past 6 months and all the attention that's been paid to it. But there's still a big gap in terms of understanding how closely these are. They're not the same. There are carcinogens that are in cigarette smoke that just by the fact that it's smoke aren't necessarily in vapes, but vice versa as well. But we need to really do what we can to try to kind of close that gap and get young people to realize that it's a lot closer to cigarette smoke than they might think. So unfortunately, this is the slide that I've had to update almost every week. I never thought that I'd be paying so close attention to the Thursday CDC report on what's going on out there with, fortunately, it has started to level off a little bit, but I remember when I first put these slides together and started doing a lot of these presentations kind of in the early fall, up until the beginning of December, I was having to change it. First it was 15 and 23, 32, 47. It just kept going up and up and up and up, both the deaths and the different types of illnesses that came across from it. So about 80% of the cases that we're talking about here with these vaping devices and why this has really exploded so much as a health crisis over the past 6 months, a lot of it has to do with black market marijuana products that have been out there, particularly ones that have been tainted with pesticides and fungicides, or something called vitamin E acetate, which actually is in a lot of hand creams, and it even can be in food additives. But if you think about it, when you put hand cream on your skin, that's kind of a barrier, right? Or if you eat something, you have all the stomach acids that are providing protection. But your lungs are a completely different story. It's almost more like tissue paper, right? And vitamin E acetate is an oil-based product. So imagine inhaling a can of nonstick spray that you'd use to cook eggs or whatever. That's kind of how I sound. I sound like I've inhaled some of that stuff. But so it should be obvious why we're seeing a lot. When you talk about all the different chemicals, when you talk about all these adulterants that are in there in a market where it's not being lab tested or regulated, fortunately, I think part of the reason why it's starting to level off is I think a lot of these adulterants that are in these products are starting to get pulled and not get distributed as much, or I think younger people are getting wiser about not using these types of products as these dank vapes and other black market brands that are causing these problems. They're getting wise to it because they don't want to end up in a hospital. They don't want to end up dead themselves. So this is my man right here. This is my man Chance. He's an 18-year-old from Florida. He, in the past 6 months, so he ended up in the hospital over the summer with a collapsed lung after a couple years. He's in that 20%, meaning that he claimed, we have to go take his word for it, that he admitted it was heavy jewel use, the nicotine vaping device, but that it was heavy use, but not marijuana use, but he ended up with a collapsed lung, ended up in the hospital, emergency surgery, fortunately is fully recovered. But in the past 6 months, he really has become a huge advocate for really trying to get young people to be aware of what they're really inhaling with these products. He's founded his own foundation. I think it's called the Lung Love Foundation. He has his own podcast. He's spoken on Capitol Hill. He's spoken at school after school after school. To me, people like him are going to be the real turning point. It's going to be that kind of that 17 to 19 to 20-year-old age range, when that age range, I think, is starting to get fed up a little bit, because I think they're starting to feel like that they got sold a false bill of goods. And that's what really will cause change, is the social media. Social media grew this monster, and I think it's going to take social media to take it down. And you talk about, I don't know if anybody know the Truth Initiative. They're an organization that does a lot of anti-smoking, a lot of anti-cigarette campaigning. And they've started to pay some of the social media influencers. It's really the idea of using this industry's playbook against them. It worked to build it. It could work to break it down too, right? Where these influencers are encouraging people to post videos of creative ways that they've stopped. The hashtag, this is quitting, I think was the hashtag. As of today, up to 1.4 billion views. So there's something growing in terms of young people, like I said, particularly kind of, I think, late teens, that are really starting to gain some traction in terms of trying to fight against this. And that's what we need to, this information, we need to use this as fuel. Get that to young people. Get it to educators. Get it to people who can get accurate information out there so that we can fight against this. I know you can't read it probably because it's too small, but the main reason why I like to show this slide is just so you can see. It might be difficult to see, but these are scans of Chance's lungs. And if you look closely, you can see black dots throughout his lungs. And as you would imagine, black dots are not part of normal, healthy 18-year-old lung tissue. So, and every week that goes by, there's more and more articles emerging about the harmful effects of these devices, whether they're these disposable vaping devices, which have become really popular this school year, or Juul, Fix, or all these different brands. A lot of people don't realize they're really, really efficient nicotine delivery systems. They're so efficient that you could see in terms of the amount of nicotine that's in the bloodstream when they test, how quickly kids are getting addicted to these things when they start versus cigarettes. So, in terms of addiction, these things are a lot worse than cigarettes are, because they're extracted nicotine salts that are really efficient at getting people hooked and delivering that nicotine. And so that's a huge problem. And that's why you hear so many kids like this, the quote at the bottom, saying, I had no idea. I just thought it was going to be mango flavored. I knew there was nicotine in it, but I didn't realize I was going to be hooked where I couldn't put the thing down at all. So that's what we're dealing with. And that's why we're getting a lot of younger people that are angry, because they feel like they've been misled. And we want to utilize that. We want to utilize that anger in a way that's productive to kind of fight back against this hugely growing trend that we've had. So I just wanted to show, I'd be happy to share any of this information. All of this just comes from a bunch of different sources that I try to be very careful about where I pick my sources from and make sure that they're credible. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.